Nathan and I have been working together here at our studio in Los Angeles for 4 or 5 years now. I'm a film composer working in film and TV and video games. Nathan has been working here with me as my engineer for recording, mixing, sound design, mastering, everything to do with audio and technology.
Yeah, and about a year ago, we were going through a lot of the custom samples that we make here, and trying to figure out how to maybe use them in new, interesting ways. And having just done a little scripting in Kontakt, I had this idea of maybe we should start making some Kontakt instruments using these samples. And then after a few days, Jeff had this idea of 4 samples that rotate in sync with each other, and that became basically the beginning of orbital synthesis and the instrument itself.
Orbit, before Orbit existed, just in my process as a composer, every project I do starts with some period of time spent in developing sounds. I started off before I was a composer, helping other composers develop a sonic signature and a sonic library, and I worked with guys like Hans Zimmer and Mark Isham and just a whole slew of great, interesting composers. And that led me in my own career to start working on the idea that every project needs a signature of some kind. And so over the years, I've just developed a whole range of techniques for sound design that are musical, that really apply well to picture, that have texture, that have rhythm and pulse. But they're very complicated. I spend days or weeks developing even a single idea for a sound that becomes a key element to a score of mine. So Nathan and I started to play around with this idea as he started working more in getting inside of Kontakt, which we've been using here in-house at the studio for some of our projects here. How could we take this very complex process and make it something that other people could use in a much more fluid way? And that really got Orbit off the ground.
Yeah, for sure. So as we were working with this new Orbit engine, which, we had just started thinking about, as we added more features, it became this whole different thing where the potential was something that we'd never really seen in an instrument before. And we had to figure out, how do we make it as flexible as possible while still keeping it easy to use? So with dozens of features, we kind of started paring it down, and as our to-do list and potential feature list got exponentially bigger, there was a hard balance to maintain, but at the end we got something that was really, I think, well received.
Yeah.
And the feedback we've had has been really great. So
I think what's important is that there's 2 sides to Orbit. One is the sounds, but just like a composer who uses electronics realizes, it's not the sounds, it's what you do with them. It's how you make a sound into something more musical. And what Orbit is, it's not a sample library, but inside of Orbit are sounds that Nathan and I created very meticulously and really carefully, using everything from acoustic instruments and electronic instruments and bowed instruments and wind instruments, analog synthesizers, digital synthesizers, very complicated software processing, morphing, you name it. But that's not really what Orbit is. Orbit has that sort of inside its guts. But the cool thing, I think, about Orbit is that we came up with a way to take those elements and make them create something that sounds completely fresh, completely different, but under the user's control. And Nathan just became obsessed with how to make it as simple and musical as possible. And really, complexity is easy, simplicity is hard. Whether it's designing a sound, designing an instrument, or even composing music, simplicity is always the hardest thing. And Nathan kept this sort of as his mantra of how do we do something that is innovative but always keeping it so that it doesn't get into that sort of overwhelming feature creep that sometimes makes certain instruments sort of unobtainable.
The instrument started out as a way for us to create these new types of sounds using techniques that would usually take us a long time. And this has everything basically in one interface. These pulses, these soundscapes. And the way that you can kind of play with the instrument is very fast. You can create new sounds by, just a few different button presses and features. So...
Are you saying that it's mostly for lazy people?
Well...
Like me?
Well, actually what's important about that is that it allows you to experiment much more quickly. Mm-hmm. It doesn't take you 10 minutes to create something that you don't like. And that's a nice thing for anyone trying to be creative.
Actually, that's a really good point because, in the process of being inspired, if it's too complicated and if it takes too long, the initial thing is gone. That spark kind of disappears really easily. We felt that if it wasn't something you could do within really moments, then it bogged the whole process down. I mean, for me as a composer, and I think for you in every way, it's important to have a kind of a laboratory / playground where you can experiment, be really free, get surprises, and then go, wait a minute, I'm onto something. Let me refine that. Let me tune that to something I'm really trying to do, and then save it, and you're done, and then you move on. And Orbit does that really well, and that was hard. That was actually really hard to accomplish. But in terms of who it's for, I mean, what do you think?
Well, in film and video game soundtracks, you have a lot of freedom for creativity and using new sounds, and because you need something that's specific to your project. And so that has kind of become our primary user base. That said, the soundscapes and for like electronic music and pop music is also changing quite fast now. And what people listen to, next month is going to sound totally different from what they're listening to this month. And so with any environment where you can quickly make new sounds that are unique, I think that really works for a lot of different music producers these days.
I mean, Orbit definitely has a sound. It's not a Swiss Army knife of, doing anything. It has a kind of a depth, and it has a very three-dimensional sound. So while I'm kind of biased towards score work that really loves those kinds of deep sounds, even if it's for rhythmic pulses. Things that it's a very abstract instrument. It's a very deep instrument, but I always envisioned it primarily as an instrument for people like me and like what Nathan and I do here at the studio, which is that kind of scoring for media. But we've already been surprised. I don't want to say shocked. Surprised at electronic producers and record producers who've started using it and love it because it just doesn't sound like anything else. So, I guess at the end of the day, we had our thoughts about it, but that doesn't really matter.
Yeah. We decided to use Kontakt as our platform for Orbit because we started developing in-house, and it allowed us to prototype very quickly. And Kontakt has a lot of flexibility for sound manipulation, and that's kind of where we were coming from with Orbit. And also, Kontakt is basically ubiquitous in the industry that we work in. Everybody uses it, everybody has it. So this would make it much easier to let people kind of jump in.
Yeah. We've been using I mean, we use everything here at the studio, technology-wise, but we've definitely been using Kontakt for our own sound design heavily. So Nathan and I just got so comfortable in it as a sound design tool for our own use here and for the scores that we've done here. Nothing as sophisticated as Orbit, but Kontakt just has so much horsepower under the hood that it was just the way that we could do something and do it pretty quickly, but have the maximum amount of power that we could put into it, and it needed it, so it's been great. The sounds that we created in Orbit are very personal. They encompass 20 plus years of thinking about and composing with electronic sounds. And what's unusual about the sounds in Orbit, and what makes Orbit unusual, is that they're not just single events. They're not waveforms. They're not samples in the traditional sense. What they are lengthy sounds that slowly morph and change over a long period of time, and eventually they loop. But everyone is a bit different, and everyone's a different length, and the shifts are quite subtle, so that whenever you press a note, whenever you play a note in Orbit, 4 sounds that you choose are triggered, but you only hear one at first, and then it morphs to the next and morphs to the next, and it literally rotates, it orbits. And in that, you start to find the relationships between these sounds, and that's quite exciting. And there's an infinite number of ways of doing that. But what Nathan realized was that we had to be organized and methodical about it. It wasn't just enough to say, well, here's a bunch of sounds. So what we did was we organized them from dark to light, from aggressive to mysterious, in a very methodical way. And then we started to expand on the original idea and decided some sounds would be very simple and some sounds would be very complex. And as you orbit between the sounds in the way that Orbit does it, and the Orbit engine isn't just crossfading, it's actually doing something a little more complicated. The way that one sound moves to the next, it's fascinating. And you discover new things because as the sound plays and plays and plays, if you use it for the longer you hold a note, the more it shifts, and it, in theory, never repeats. I mean, it would take weeks or months. It doesn't have to go longer than the length of a movie.
Exactly.
And so the sounds came from this careful experimentation that we did to find ways that different kinds of sounds liked each other, almost like the way a magnet pulls another magnet and then another can pull that, and it builds this whole concept of orbiting. And from there we set into creating presets that took advantage of all of those potential permutations, which Nathan really headed that whole section up. Yeah. How did that go?
Just to add on the one thing you were saying about the interaction between the sounds, one of the most interesting pieces of really positive feedback that we've had is that people love the random button. And I think that really speaks to that the engine itself is very interesting.
Well, it's part of that playground laboratory idea, that one click, and it's like, oh, I never would have thought of that.
Right.
And you could say, I like it or I don't like it, and you can move on. Right. Or you can keep half of it and then tweak half of it. It's incredibly simple.
So in creating the patches for Orbit, we set out with the goal of making sure that every patch was inspirational. So we went to our favorite composers and sound designers who had shown interest in Orbit, and between them and us, we set out to make the patches both inspiring, useful, and in some cases just showing off Orbit and everything that it can do, because it really is a deep instrument. And so we created just a huge pool of patches and picked our favorites. And aside from the technical stuff of making sure that the patches worked with the whole range of the keyboard and sound like they could be useful in film and games, we basically just strove for quality in every every patch.
I think for any composer who works in electronics, works with electronic sounds for film or games or anything, really, records, anything, there's this vital idea of working with sounds that are inspiring, that give you ideas, that a sound actually gives you an idea. The sound isn't the idea, but you hear a sound, you find something under your fingers that feels organic to that sound, if it's slow, if it's fast, if it's pulsating, if it's bright, and suddenly an inspiring sound brings out an inspired idea from a musician, a composer. And that to me is what is vital and exciting and thrilling about writing music with electronic instruments. And what I've done my whole life, and Nathan and I have talked about this so much, about the idea of sound being an inspiration. And that's a key element, you know? If you write for piano, you write one thing. If you write for strings, you write something different, because the sound of those instruments inspires a different thing. They just exist in a different world from each other. With electronic sounds, which are abstract, that are, you know, bendable and malleable, you can, you know, you have unlimited possibilities. But with any one idea, with any one sound, there's some things that will work musically and some that don't. So the key for me when I design sounds for myself is, does it inspire me to do something that only that sound would do? And then what is the music of that sound? And finding that is kind of magical and mystical and musical. Sounds like a Beatles album. And and is it the heart of what makes electronic music work? Is when the sound and the performance and the musical ideas are really organic to one another. And bring it back to Orbit, we were inspired by it from the get-go, and I've already used it in like several scores. You know, the version that's out there, but you know, before that, I was using the sort of its precursor as well, and there's such a joy in being able to work quickly and fluidly and organically and come up with something that feels very personal, but not take a lot of time to do it, so that you can focus on what's important, and what's important is the music.